genuinely believe that there should not be a KPI for everything. Long time back, one of my managers told me, at the end of the day, obviously look at the data, look at whatever you can measure, but there is something called the gut. Gut comes from a lot of experience that you have done across your different roles, and sometimes it's just okay to go with. Sometimes you obsess about numbers and KPIs.
Right.
You miss the big picture, or you just get so focused on delivering that KPI that you just tend to lose a lot of other things in the process, and I'm not a big fan.
Welcome to the Brand Podcast, where you'll learn from successful omnichannel brands, which in turn will help your brand grow. Here's your host, Liron Hirschkorn. The Brand Podcast.
Liron Hirschkorn, your host of the Brand Podcast, and you're about to listen to a series of episodes we recorded at Shop Talk with some very special guests, all hosted by our VP of Marketing, Kate Bray. Enjoy the episodes.
Welcome to Chapter 4 of the Retail Renaissance series. I am sitting here with Vivek Rastogi, the Senior Director of Global Digital Commerce at Colgate-Palmolive. I am also joined by Incrementum Digital's CEO and founder, Liron Hirschkorn. And today, we're going to talk all about AMC, which is why I am so excited to welcome you, Vivek.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. First, can you just tell us about yourself and kind of fill our audience in on how you found yourself to be the Senior Director of Global Digital Commerce?
Yes. Yes, I am part of our global digital team, as we call it. So I kind of look at the end-to-end digital commerce strategy for Colgate-Palmolive, work with all the markets on the ground, as well as my leadership team to kind of look at different strategies, different frameworks that we need to do in digital commerce as a vertical to drive growth. And I also lead our global relationship with Amazon, specifically from a retailer side. And I kind of look at, I work with Amazon across the ecosystem, so that's retail, advertising, media, even supply chain and packaging and things like that. So
awesome. So the reason that Liron is joining us today is actually because of your direct involvement with Amazon. So one thing that we've discovered over the last year since AMC has gone live is the smoke and mirrors surrounding AMC, not by intention, but I think that I would love today to have a discussion between the three of us, particularly an agency owner and someone who is on the execution side of AMC and just Amazon in general at the scale that Colgate-Palmolive is. And so the first question I'd like to ask you is, what have you observed about digital commerce throughout your career that many people may not think of and might be valuable for someone like Liron or like an agency owner to consider?
Well, interesting question. So I've been in the digital commerce space for about 6-7 years now. And I think over the course of my time in digital commerce, what I've realized is there are two different aspects of looking at it. Yeah. If you look at it from a consumer lens, they don't really think about digital commerce as different from any other channel, right? For them, it's just shopping and they want to be as seamless as possible. I always say that, when I speak to my family and friends, they don't understand e-commerce versus brick and mortar and omni-channel and all the buzzwords that we keep using. So that makes me realize for them, it's just, integrated shopping. It doesn't matter whether they're clicking on a desktop or a mobile or going into the store. So that's one aspect of looking at digital commerce, which I think a lot of brands and companies like us tend to sometimes overcomplicate it by naming different channels.
It's complex, yeah.
It is. But on the other side, from a brand or a company perspective, I think it's completely the opposite, where it's just not about looking at your brick and mortar strategy and just putting it in e-commerce and just maybe tweaking a few things here and there. It's not that simple. It is a completely different stream. It's a completely different mindset. It's a completely different strategy that you have to put together because it is very complex, as you said, right? So I think from a brand side, we have to look at things differently. A lot of times I've seen teams and companies just look and saying, okay, this has really worked well in brick and mortar and we can replicate the same thing on e-commerce. Doesn't really work.
Have you seen I imagine you've seen a shift over the years. I remember coming to, shows back, let's say over the last 10 years, and early on come to shows and you kind of mentioned Amazon. It was kind of like a dirty word. Many brands like, don't even talk to me about Amazon. They're finding it disrupted with like their other channels in retail. How about from like Colgate's perspective, like over the last 10 years, how has that evolution been shifting from, leaning more into the marketplaces and the commerce platforms?
I think I won't say that it's a dirty word.
Not anymore.
I work with them, so I cannot.
Right.
No, but on a serious note, I think it is different. I think Amazon's very, very different. And I think what we have done over the last, I would say, 4 to 5 years in our relationship with Amazon is to kind of look inward and actually understand and embrace that difference. Because I think the biggest mistake that a lot of companies tend to do is to kind of look at Amazon as just another retailer and again try to kind of do the same things that they have done with other retailers, and that does not really work with Amazon for 2 reasons.
So what's an example of sort of looking at it like everything else as opposed to trying to be more targeted?
The first thing that I tell about Amazon, and especially internally, is saying you got to understand Amazon as an organization, and they're a tech company. And how many times companies like us, CPG brands, have actually dealt with a tech company? We've never done that. We've always dealt with the Walmarts and the Targets and the Tescos of the world, who are not tech companies. Amazon just happens to be a tech company with a very, very big retail business. And I think that mindset shift changes a lot of things, because your expectation of Amazon and what they will bring to the table, what our meetings would be like, are so different. And a lot of times, to be honest, it's a source of frustration for a lot of brands, because they expect the same kind of discussion that they would have with other retailers, but not with Amazon. So I think that's definitely different. And then, of course, the fact that they're a marketplace, they're so algorithmically driven. I'm sure you've heard saying the biggest challenge that people talk about, saying, how do you even discuss an algorithm, or how do you negotiate with an algorithm, really? Because that's what it is. Because a lot of times when you talk to Amazon, most of the time, or a lot of times, the answer is, I don't know, it's just driven by the algorithm. And that frustrates a lot of people. And I think, again, going back to that, it's that understanding and acknowledgement of the fact that this is how that company is built in, and that's why that company has been so successful. Kind of take that in your stride. In sales, we always talk about understanding your customer. And I think that has never been truer than it is about Amazon. You got to really understand how they're built. And I come from Seattle, and trust me, 8 out of the 10 people that I meet on my daily life are Amazonians, and it is fascinating to see how they go about things versus a lot of other retailers that I've handled in the past.
That's to your point. I love that you called Amazon a tech company. There's so much data there, and it seems like just in the last couple of years, we've started to really get true access to that data as an agency.
And, just one more point, and this is an anecdote that I always give. If you really look at Wall Street, right, they always compare Amazon results and Amazon share prices with the other techs. They will never compare Amazon to a Walmart or a Target, or things like that. So it is a tech.
Yeah, that is something I want to get into. So I would love to start diving into AMC, but just for our listeners, Liran, can you define what AMC is, what it stands for, what it is for?
Sure. I'm sure you could do a much better job working with it directly. But essentially, AMC is what's called a clean room, right? Which is basically a AWS data bucket where you have all the possible data of any interaction with your brand that Amazon can sort of put into that bucket, and then anonymize the data, and then you can really get a lot of insights from it. I guess to go from there and ask what has been the biggest use case for, let's say, for you, in terms of what's been the one piece of data, or like the one shift you've made as a result of now having access to, let's say, customer journey or audiences, or what's been that one impactful?
To be honest, we are just starting our journey on AMC on a serious note, right? AMC has been hanging around for a couple of years now.
That blew my mind when you mentioned that earlier. I can't believe this. The business as large as Colgate is just getting started with AMC. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and you're right. Like, it blows my mind as well, saying AMC has been around for a few years, and it is free for now, and still, a lot of companies have not really adopted it, and I believe there are good reasons for it. AMC, as you explained it, right? It's very new. It involves a lot of tech, which a lot of people don't realize it. It's very tech heavy,
Right.
and sometimes just kind of complicates things a lot. So that's one aspect of it. And of course, as everything with the retail media, it just takes time for, companies to accept and adopt and, really realize the potential. But at Colgate now, I would say for the last 1 year, we've been kind of dabbling with it, especially in the last 4 or 5 months. We've been working directly with Amazon and their AMC and the ad tech team, and they've been really, really supportive in terms of building that entire tech infrastructure to begin with. But to answer your question in terms of use cases, we've done a few pilots. We've tested it in a few markets, and there have been some really fascinating use cases. But the one that comes to my mind, at the top of my mind, is we did this about frequency in terms of how many times a certain user is exposed to a certain campaign or an ad. And we realized one of our campaigns, or a lot of our campaigns, were being exposed to the same user about 25 plus times.
Wow.
And you would suddenly realize, saying, if the person's not converted in the first 10 or 15 or whatever that number is,
Right.
Exposing them 25 times
And you can kind of see in the data, right, what is that ideal
and we
frequency.
did that. We exactly did that. So we did all the analysis. We looked at all the data, and we then came to a point saying, this is the sweet spot between an X and Y number, which is much lower than the 25.
Right.
And that's great, because you can then utilize that insight, convert, or you use that in your media activation. And so we did frequency caps and things like that, where we realized there was hardly any difference in the conversion, but we are obviously able to save a ton of money there.
Right. Use that
then
elsewhere.
Either use that elsewhere,
Or just
target news audience segments, or just save that
more
money in your
profitable.
bottle, right? So this is just one of those use cases, and there are obviously a lot of them. We are actually now also looking. We are undergoing a pilot where we are integrating our first-party data with AMC, and that's just a tremendous.
So maybe talk a little bit about that in terms of what does that mean? Does that mean your email list, your data off visitors to the website? I don't believe you don't sell D2C, right? So
No, we do.
you do.
Actually. We do.
So taking that data and incorporating, what's the leverage there in terms of, or what's the gain sort of from taking that data and now integrating it together?
So again, lots of use cases just within that bigger umbrella of integrating your first-party data with AMC. But some of the things that we have started doing is to kind of embed that data and actually compare audience segments, and then you can actually go into things like lifetime value and subscriptions and loyalty part of it, and then we are able to compare audiences, saying, here's the kind of audience who's buying your same categories on Amazon versus on your direct-to-consumer or your first-party data. Is our first-party data better? What is their lifetime value? What is their purchase frequency and things like that? And then you can also model audiences there for, like, do I need to change something on my first-party data collection strategies because the Amazon audiences are more useful or more productive,
Right.
or vice versa, so that we can then target a better audience on Amazon. So that's how we are kind of looking at it right now. But again, it's just been.
Was there any, let's say, significant learning there between audience that's buying on your D2C site versus, let's say, Amazon's audiences?
Yes, there have been a lot of learnings. I think to begin with, and the kinds is kind of obvious as well. The audiences that come to your direct-to-consumer sites just seems to be more loyal than in Amazon, because possibly the shopping around behavior is a little lesser. So that's kind of, as I said, obvious. But then we are able to actually quantify that, and then actually say, okay, if this is how it's happening, how can I replicate this audience on my Amazon audience and target those specific kind of audience profiles on Amazon to get better returns and things like that.
So you mentioned that also the infrastructure that you're having to build at the same time as you're learning to navigate AMC. What has that been like, building that team? And I mean, I'm sure it just adds on top of the burden of trying to understand AMC and the ins and outs of it. I mean, what advice would you give to other CPG brands or, CPG operators building a similar team around something like AMC?
Yeah, so I think the biggest advice that I can look at it specifically, the team's a big gap right now because, again, talking from a CPG industry perspective, you need data scientists to be able to run queries in AMC and extract data, but it requires a certain level of expertise to be able to do that. So that's one part of it. Now, it's an expensive thing to build a team like that just around one tool. So we are trying to now figuring out a model in terms of, is it okay to go external? Should we build it internally?
It seems like
for the Amazon.
You could sell that, I mean, eventually anonymize and then sell that data to someone like Statista. Yeah. And then, I mean, it's because you've got your D2C data, you've got your AMC data, you've got multiple channels in there, and there's so many insights.
Yeah, we are trying to work with some external partners to help that because a lot of companies out there have built AMC dashboards and things like that. Sure. I don't think so we are there yet where we start to look at selling our data or monetizing that data. Okay. But on the other aspect of, how, what are some of the, the tech challenges and the biggest advices on AMC, I think AMC is such a broad thing. And, one of the advice that I always give to my teams internally is saying, you can go in so many different directions. It's that new thing that can get you so excited, and you can so easily get lost in just the number of use cases that are potentially possible. And I always advise them to go small, pick up your top priorities, start with a business question, saying if this is the business question that you want to answer, then go for it, rather than trying to do 50 use cases at the same time. Right. And the other thing that I always tell them, saying, close the loop. A lot of times I've realized that, we are just so happy to extract data and look at insights, but then use that data to actually do something on your media campaigns and execution and things like that. Otherwise, you're just wasting a lot of time.
Are you looking at, we know that some brands, and we do this sometimes, are looking sort of at a linear attribution model, let's say, or, if there's multiple ad types that ultimately lead to a conversion, you sort of take your ROAS and divide it by each segment to kind of better understand. Are you doing that? Because obviously the whole thing with AMC is like last touch attribution is flawed, right? And this gives you that path to conversion. So is it causing you to sort of change the way you attribute sales to a particular ad type?
We are looking at ad types in terms of looking at. One of the use cases, again, has been to kind of look at the combination of different ad types and what really works. That's a standard use case in AMC. But even from an attribution model, you're right. We are moving away from a linear or a last touch attribution because AMC and clean rooms allow you to do that. We don't have a definitive answer yet in terms of what kind of attribution should we be measuring, but we are, again, testing a few use cases to see what really works. A lot of time, it, again, depends on what you're trying to really measure and what's your KPI. But yes, it is no longer just the simple case of, okay, it should be the last touch attribution and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you also, like, in general, just how you think about the catalog and what you're targeting in general, because you have a large catalog and
so many brands too.
So many brands and overlap between those brands, competition between those brands.
Right.
How, what products you show to which audiences, how much overlap. How do you sort of determine what's going to be the focus?
I would say it's kind of the other way around for us, right? We are not really looking at, of course, we have different brands and companies, and a lot of those brands do have similar products. But the way we have, we run brands is we try to have a definitive, positioning of each brand. Mm-hmm. So just in our portfolio, for example, we are a big oral care business, but we have Colgate and we have Tom's of Maine and we have Hello, and they have very distinct positioning, both in terms of what the brand stands for, the audiences, the segments, and things like that. So we kind of work backwards and kind of look at that positioning and therefore what we need to do, rather than just try to say, I'm going to promote this versus that because they're going to be competing and all that stuff. Now, obviously, it's easier said than done, and a lot of times there are overlaps like that. But interestingly, also, we have a big Hills pet food company, which is a big pet food business that we have, especially on e-commerce. That's huge for us. We've got into premium skincare recently, which is, again, a big play for us as well.
Seems like it's booming.
It is. And, just the products lend so well to digital commerce and e-commerce in general. Right. They're kind of smaller brands that we have in our portfolio, but they're growing significantly fast, and that's a big priority for us from a premiumization perspective and our P&Ls in general. So, but to answer your question, it is the other way around. Like, we look at what the brand stands for, what is the positioning, and then kind of activate them accordingly.
Right. Makes sense.
Recently, in a LinkedIn post, you talked about the shift from doing digital to being digital.
Right.
Can you expand on that? Explain what you mean by that?
Actually, this actually came from our chief digital officer, Pete King. She actually has said that in
Chief being digital.
Yeah. So I think the notion of that was, it's, when you talk about digital transformation, it is not really about just doing some digital projects and digital tasks. For us, we need to move to being digital, which means more of a mindset shift for the entire organizations, right? So we're trying to push the envelope internally, where we are saying that digital is no more the responsibility of only the e-commerce or the digital teams. It is the responsibility for every single employee in the organization. And therefore, it's not about, okay, I've checked 5 projects this year because they're digital projects. It is about just mindset, where you're thinking digital first, and therefore everything that we're doing is with that mindset. And the reason for that is not just because it's cool to say that. It is cool to say that as well. But
cool.
it is also about, that's how the consumer is behaving today, right? Everything is more digital than it is analog or offline, and that's why that's the cultural shift that we want to bring into the organization, saying you got to just be digital in your thinking and how you approach your day-to-day work, irrespective of whether you are sitting in a digital team.
Yeah, and how do you think that might translate for someone in a role like a brick and mortar merchandising or a buyer role?
It translates, like, for example, even in the brick and mortar, the teams that are managing the brick and mortar stores, right? They are constantly being spoken about, the .com part of the business and so on and so forth. So it's simple things like, even if you're going for a sales pitch or you're listing an item, right? Are you having that lens saying how will that particular product or your pricing strategy or whatever it is will work digitally or on the e-commerce platform? I keep giving an example of innovation, for example, right? When you're looking into your innovation pipelines, a lot of us just tend to think of how that product will sit on the shelf and whether it'll look good, not look good, and all that stuff. But now you have to go back, and when you're building that innovation pipeline, you also have to think, saying, if it's going to be the same product online, will it work online? Will the packaging work online? Will it survive the rigors of e-commerce?
And are you thinking digital first in terms of that packaging? Is it created for the physical shelf, or is it created for the digital shelf? Because one thing I've seen over the years with people who started natively on digital is their packaging, their look, it's designed to, for example, stand out on a white background because that's Amazon, right? And take up more space in the image, etc. And then they're not necessarily, thinking about retail. Whereas retail brands sometimes will put their product on the digital shelf, and then it doesn't really stack up. Because, what we see brands that are putting like the benefit of the product in big, right? And again, on the retail shelf, people are browsing, they have time, they pick it up, they look at it, and digital shelf, you have a second to capture attention and get the click. So are you now sort of designing products with that digital first in mind?
I wouldn't say only digital first, because again, that's the complexity in our business. We still have a huge
retail
side of the business, so the retail side of the business.
Sure, especially outside of the US, even bigger.
Yeah, even bigger outside of the US, but even in the US, it's still much bigger than the e-commerce side of the business.
Right.
And therefore, it is challenging for us. We can't just move from one to the other. And what we are trying to therefore do is to kind of what I call a minimum common denominator, at least in your packaging and products, saying, okay, you need to have that basic stuff in your products, whether you put it on the shelf or you put it on the digital shelf. And then, of course, tweak things accordingly to make it more convincing for the consumers to buy. But I work a lot with my packaging and supply chain team to work on those kind of stuff. It's not easy, because you're talking small changes, in a scale of ours. When you're manufacturing products, a small change in a cap, for example, can cost you a lot of money.
Right.
But we're trying to come to a point where at least that basic tenets of just the packaging of the product dimensions of the product specifications work on both.
And are you ever designing, or do you think does the company as a whole just design the same products that are on digital and physical retail, or do you sometimes sort of have a different SKU, think about it differently, whether it's going to be, an online only versus like a store product?
Our first priority or our first preference is to have something that will work in both,
Right.
just from an efficiency standpoint. But of course, there are cases, there are examples where we've actually built products. I wouldn't say not only e-com, but at least more e-com centric, right? So that becomes your primary channel for a particular kind of product.
Right.
And then it could be in brick and mortar as well, rather than the other way around. And that just again goes back to our consumer insights in terms of there's certain kinds of products that just have a better propensity online from a consumer standpoint than it is on brick and mortar. So we've kind of taken that path rather than just creating a completely different set of portfolios for online and brick and mortar, because that itself has huge complexity.
Right.
You spoke earlier about how you see digital commerce through the lens of both the consumer and your brand. As a consumer yourself, with the knowledge that you have of digital commerce, what are some mistakes that you see brands making on Amazon and off in TikTok Shop or Walmart or even in brick and mortar?
The first one I actually talked about, right? Which is considering Amazon or any of these e-commerce players just another retailer or another channel. They need to be approached very differently. So that's one. I think supply chain is very close to my heart.
Oh, really?
E-com operations, funnily enough. But I think other big mistake that a lot of brands tend to do is if your supply chain is really working well in brick and mortar, there's just the assumption that the same thing will work on e-commerce as well. It doesn't. You have to really look at all your supply chain processes and everything else that you've done, which has worked so brilliantly over so many years. But there are changes required to be able to be able to deliver the same level of efficiency on e-commerce. That just is a completely different set altogether. And the third thing that I would say is going back to the media and the advertising side of things. I think especially when it comes to retail media, a lot of brands still consider retail media as fairly lower funnel and conversion focused. And I think especially in some markets, not every market's there yet, but in markets like US, I think there is a tremendous opportunity now to start looking at full funnel and upper funnel from retail media perspective, and have the opportunity to genuinely build brands and brand awareness rather than that notion saying I need to invest that money in retail media just because the retailer wants it, or I need to drive sales on that platform. I think you're leaving a lot on the table if you just approach
meaning like leveraging Amazon's DSP to drive in-store sales, for example.
Absolutely. And there are studies now which are showing more and more saying the impact that Amazon, which is so big here in the US, has an impact on your brand halo, brand awareness, as well as your offline sales channels as well. So,
do you think one of the reasons behind the maybe lack of leveraging that full funnel is because not really understanding that attribution between online to offline, and how do you actually measure?
It is a lot of that. It is also, to be honest, a lot about how our organizations and teams are structured and the processes.
And too siloed, maybe?
More than too siloed, just the process in terms of there is a media team who's looking at holistic media, there is an account team who's looking at, all of these conversations and things like that. And it's just difficult to kind of have them think differently because that's how it's always worked. So it's some part of that as well. But I genuinely believe in that opportunity. And I give this example, I'm sure you're aware of the concept of non-endemic brands.
Yep.
And it's funny I say that in the month of March, but last year what blew my mind on Amazon was TurboTax in the US.
Yep.
Was advertising on the homepage of
Amazon
on the 12th, 13th of April, just because before the 15th April deadline. They don't sell anything on it.
Right.
And then for me, just classic example of that's become a eyeball play because they're trying to drive that brand awareness because everyone's at Amazon,
Right.
even when they don't sell anything. And
Right.
that's what I mean. That's saying you can genuinely build brand awareness now by advertising on sites.
Right. Yeah. And I think Amazon is really leaning into that and trying to, make it an advertising platform for any brand as opposed to just, brands that are selling physical products, let's say, or selling on Amazon. They open sponsored display ads for non-endemic. And I think maybe AMC helps to unlock, you can track those, maybe people who interacted with a DSP ad, right? If they check out on your website with a pixel. And so they're providing more of the mechanisms for you to track that. But there seems to still be that opportunity because a lot of brands have still not embraced this, right? Which means like there's maybe a more cost-effective play on Amazon because it's not fully being realized yet by...
That's true. And this will take time. This is possibly something that even Amazon's only started talking a few months back, maybe a couple of years back. It'll take time, There's still a lot of skeptics in the industry who would think that, upper funnel is too expensive on Amazon and things like that. And I always keep telling them it depends on what you measure. Right? Are you looking at all this dollar invested, say on Amazon or any other retail media, and just looking at sales on that media, or you're broadening it up to kind of looking at your overall sales with MMM studies and things like that? Well, it'll be a slow change, but I'm sure we'll get there.
If you were on the agency side, how would you go about communicating the value of the upper funnel initiatives?
I think, just test and learns and being able to measure, especially using tools like AMC now, and just putting, infallible facts on the table saying that this works. And we are actually doing some custom studies now with Amazon directly where they're helping us measure the omni-channel impact or an offline impact of those advertising dollars because they have video now and streaming TV and all of that stuff.
Right. And how do you, let's say an example, is the best way to measure that to maybe run streaming in one market? Let's say I'm going to run it in LA and I'm going to see if my sales in brick and mortar within that market grow based on this. Like, is that sort of how to think about maybe measuring and testing that?
Could be. We haven't done a geo-based thing yet, but absolutely, as I said, there's just so many ways of doing that. But what we are trying to do is kind of look at, okay, if I've run an upper funnel thing and, then tracking the past 2 purchases and tracking the consumer journey and see where does the conversion actually happen, what was the effect and things like that. So that's where we're kind of looking at it more holistically and more broadly at this point of time. But you're right, like we can actually get down to that level of granularity and saying, here's the geography, this is what we did, here's the test and B test.
And I guess with some properties, like let's say maybe Amazon Whole Foods, or if you're talking about retail media like Kroger online to offline, is that Kroger has like 96% attribution in store because people are using their loyalty card, and then they could track if that user's seen the ad. But I guess some of the challenging part is sort of when you're on all those channels, right? Like making sense of these walled gardens and making sense of the impact of your ads.
How do you measure the fact that I might be in a certain store but on another app in the store and looking at things like that? So it is that's what happens, right? A lot of times you're in a store but you're comparing prices on some other retailer's app at the same time.
Do you have this philosophy? Maybe it's more of a philosophical question, but should there be a KPI for everything, or should there just be some marketing that is there is no KPI, but we understand that we see some correlation, or because at the end of the day, it's impossible to measure every single activity, right? With like the end ROAS of it.
No, it's funny you asked me that because I might be an exception here or in the minority who genuinely believe that there should not be a KPI for everything.
Right.
And, this is something that a long time back, one of my managers told me, saying at the end of the day, obviously look at the data, look at whatever you can measure, but, there is something called the gut. And
Right.
that comes from a lot of experience that, you have done across your different roles. And sometimes it's just okay to go with it.
Right.
And of course, you got to balance it out a little bit. But I genuinely think not everything needs to be a KPI. And sometimes it's just sometimes you obsess about numbers and
Right.
KPIs.
And you're missing the big picture, maybe.
You miss the big picture, or you just get so focused on delivering that KPI that you just tend to
Forget
lose a lot of other things in the process. And I'm not a big fan of
We had one of the speakers here from Zappos yesterday, and he was talking about how delivering happiness. Right, that was a book that Tony Hsieh wrote, and he said, "What's the KPI on hugging your mom?" Right, like they're gonna get benefit, right? But sort of measuring that, like that way you go above and beyond for your customer or things like that. You can't always sort of measure the KPI, but it's important to do those activities. I think especially for as you're starting, right? Like you can do the unscalable things, calling customers and getting feedback on a new product, right? It's not scalable, but it's still worth doing. Same, I think, with like certain marketing activity that, like you said, the gut, you just kind of, go with your gut. And I agree. I think you're in the minority on that, because today, so we have so much data that everyone wants to measure like every single.
I might get into trouble by saying.
Okay, good. Maybe we'll make that the teaser for the podcast. I don't believe in KPIs.
Yeah. So is there anything on your AMC wish list?
Just dive into it is what I'm telling
Yeah.
the teams, right? Don't overthink it. Of course, as I said, it's tech heavy. So we're trying to, at least in my role, I'm trying to get the tech infrastructure set up for the team so that they don't have to worry about that. But my only wish list is just get into it. Not much can go wrong by just getting into it, and
Right.
then don't try to get everything perfect before you go get into it. So the sooner we do it, the better it is. Really, that's
awesome. We talk a lot about the challenges that are coming from the changes in the retail media space. What do you think, aside from, you spoke a little bit about full funnel opportunities and upper funnel initiatives, and how now that it's easier to measure a lot of that, that's going to be more of an opportunity. But what are some other opportunities that you have your eye on, maybe looking ahead to the next 12 months to 5 years to even 10 years, especially considering how much more data is going to come from the AI-driven search? I mean, people are going to be searching for, instead of just saying, I need a pair of ankle socks, they're going to say, this is why I'm searching for this. This is the occasion. I mean, there's going to be more data to measure and even larger teams necessary to organize that data. What other opportunities do you see?
I think from my standpoint, the biggest opportunity that I see, of course, Gen AI and whatever it's gonna do to this entire ecosystem is something that everyone's waiting and watching and seeing, how that develops. But for me, at this point of time, just the ability of retail media networks to start genuinely measuring omni-channel is a big thing. So we've always talked about retail media mostly in the sense of digital and what it can do, but now you have in-store displays, right? And you can actually capture data now with
Right.
that. And that's an interesting opportunity.
And Amazon is leaning very heavily into fresh and whole foods.
Yeah, fresh, whole food, but even some of the other retailers like
Right.
Uber's getting into in-store displays and interactives and all of that stuff. And I think that's something that we have started to talk about a little bit, but not as much as we talk in the digital realm. And that for me is exciting. As I said, still, for most of the companies, the majority of the revenue is still coming from brick and mortar. And, that was
Right.
always that thing. Okay, I'll put an end cap or a gondola shelf and the sales
Right.
will do. But again, we'll possibly be able to measure that impact now, which for me
Yes.
is very exciting. And that's definitely something that I expect. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in that space in the next
I saw that here at the show Chop Talk, Instacart had their smart cart. You drop in a bag of Tostitos,
Yep.
and then camera sees it, and then it's showing you ads for salsa right there, right? And it can show you ads based on the aisle that you're in or where you are in the store, right? So it's just going to get very interesting into the ability to be very hyper targeted in your ads.
Yeah, the only thing that I always keep talking about, saying, as much as we get excited about all these opportunities, we got to also remember saying it should not become too intrusive to the consumers.
Right.
It needs to be seamless. Otherwise, if they're just getting by the
Right.
third of interventions.
Yeah, and then they're not
it's a
going to come back. They're not going to want to do that experience twice. If
Yeah.
there's a big seam to it, they're going to leave with a bad taste in their mouth. I think I have one more question for you before we wrap this up. What's one thing that brand operators can do in the next 24 hours to improve their retail media execution?
Again, we touched upon this a little bit, but for me, I think that notion and the belief that retail media is just media, right? We need to start looking at retail media as just like any other mainstream media. We're going back to the upper funnel or brand awareness, that it is a platform that we have where we can genuinely build brands, rather than looking at retail media and saying, okay, I have to invest that dollars because a certain retailer wants it, or I have a JBP with them and they have money to invest and sprinkle some money there. It is genuinely looking at them as a platform like any other media. So this is what we're working in, with our media teams and saying, when you're doing your holistic media planning and you're looking at linear TV and print and out of home and all the other channels, include retail media at that stage.
Right.
So far, it's a lot of it saying, I've done all my planning. Here is some allocation of money going to the customer teams, and now you figure out what you want to do. I think we need to bring that up. And for me, therefore, the one ask is, just consider retail media as just media. It's a pure media vehicle.
Mindset.
Great. No, amazing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Vivek. This has been so cool.
Thank you.
The first, discussion about AMC and retail media that I think is just really illuminated so many things for me. So thank you for coming. Thank you for your time. And we hope to do this again soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
Pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you.